Okay, guys, we're ready to move on to discuss Japan. So, we just discussed the West and its role in China, and now we want to talk about Japan. Japan had been isolated as a kingdom for many, many years. I'm going to turn myself off in the corner so that you can see everything here. Japan was isolated from the West and really from largely from the East as an island nation. The Japanese led a solitary existence, although in the 1500s there had been some Portuguese ships that had been blown into areas of Japan, and those areas got an influence of both Christianity and trade through the Portuguese. And this little group of Christians and traders grew, and many of them came, stayed, married, had children, and by the 1500s there was a lot of growth by the late 1500s in Japanese Christianity. But the Tokugawa family, the group of rulers that dominated Japan in the 1600s, began to see Christianity and Westernization as a threat. And therefore, they desired to quash Christianity. They thought this particular dynasty thought of this as Western, thought of this as something that was tamping down Japanese culture, something that was diluting true Japanese religion and Japanese way of life. And they wanted these Christians and therefore Western influence out of Japan. And so in 1640, the Tokugawa shogunate had enough power to really seal off the borders of Japan. And they did this by casting out foreigners, banning Christians, missionaries, Westerners from entering the borders of Japan. And if they needed to, they would make an example of Christian missionaries or Christians. This picture here is often referred to as the 26 martyrs, Christians that were crucified by the power forces of the shogunate to really make a clear show of their power and their lack of tolerance for Christianity. The picture on the top is also a picture of a tradition that was started by the shogunate to keep Christian influence, because even though they had expelled a lot of Christians and they had martyred some Christians, the Japanese people, many of them had accepted Christianity by the 1600s, which is why the shogunate saw this as a threat. And so they wanted to always make sure that they were rooting out not only open Christians, Western Christians, missionary Christians, but also the Japanese Christians who held to the Christian faith. And so they had a tradition, and this tradition became known as the Furii. What would happen is that in this tradition, metal icons of the cross were placed into certain places in the floor. And what Japanese were asked to do once a year, and in certain places that were considered Christian hotspots, there were no exceptions made to this rule. They would need to come out of their houses, and then we need to walk forward. And in this walk in front of the officials of the traditional rulers, they would need to step on the cross. And in doing so, they showed their disrespect and their discarding of Christianity. And they were, of course, under threat. If they did not do this, things might happen to their families, things that might happen to them. They could be socially, politically ruined, persecuted, jailed. And so this kept Christianity, if you would imagine, although it didn't wipe it out, it kept it under wraps. And it put many Japanese Christians in difficult circumstances as they were asked to deny their faith publicly. So this meant that Japan entered this period of real about 200 years of very successful isolationism, where people were afraid to embrace Western thought, Western religion, Western philosophy, Western trade, and the Japanese leadership had been successful in keeping it out. Now, the later things got, the more lax the shogunate had become in actually enforcing and tamping down Christianity. More allowances were made, more Western influence was happening, and about this time, the US particularly, and Britain to a lesser degree, got very interested in opening Japan to a trade relationship. Now, the US saw what was going on with the other European nations and China in particular, and in seeing this, they had a desire to themselves gain a foothold in the Pacific. The Americans had settled Hawaii in the 1830s as missionaries, but they wanted to move further into the Pacific and establish themselves as a trading partner in the East. And so Western nations, and particularly the U.S., began to make some demands on Japan. Japan was so isolated that if whaling ships were in Japanese waters and they began to sink, even though it was the traditional international idea and sailing rule that you would help to rescue these sailors and bring them to shore or bring them on your boats, the Japanese refused to do this because these were Western sailors. They did not want anything to do with them. And so Western nations began to say, no, that's barbaric. That's backward. You need to help perishing sailors. You need to grow out of your isolationism. You need to be open to Western trade. As you see here in the slide, the U.S. saw this, and this is a quote from your text, as particularly hostile and barbaric, a way of life that didn't suit modern nations. And so they said Japan needs to be opened to trade. They need to be forced to open ports so that Western ideas, Western trade, Western religion, and the free flow of Western goods and Eastern goods to the West can be established. So the U.S. desired this economic entry point, but they couldn't get it. There were multiple times when the U.S. attempted to send in impressive ships, small groups of representatives to Japan who sought an audience with the Japanese rulers. But these all failed until 1853. And that's an important date. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States decided that it was about time to end this. And so with four ships at his command, two of them pictured here, he forced the opening when he steamed into the port of Edo, and said that he had some papers from the United States concerning diplomatic matters, and he refused to leave Edo Bay until he was met by a Japanese official. Now, remember, in isolationism, the Japanese usually just ignore these requests. They turned back ships by force. If necessary, they attacked ships to keep Japan isolated. Here, Matthew Perry refuses to turn around. And the Japanese, now that they're seeing what is taking place in neighboring China, right? Think of what else is going on in China with the Opium Wars and the forcing of the opening of China and Hong Kong and all of these things going over in China. So the Japanese knew that they had very little opportunity to keep the U.S. powers out, at least without a regroup, at least without a plan. And so they decided to allow Perry to come in and to speak to the Japanese leadership. They received Perry, and this receiving of Perry caused a lack of confidence of the most resistant Japanese traditionalists to the ruling regime. It was seen as weak for allowing Perry into the bay to even begin with, weak for agreeing to the audience with Perry, weak for putting Japan in the position to once again be visited and influenced by the West. And it created the conditions for the fall, for the fall of the shogunate and the creation of a modern Japanese nation state. Now we're going to have a modern Japanese nation state by 1912. we call what Matthew Perry did, you can call it gunboat diplomacy. Remember, we've talked a little bit about missionary diplomacy. We've mentioned dollar diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is when you get what you want from a foreign nation and you get agreement through the use of military power. And so we certainly see the U.S. wanting to exercise its military might. Is it for the purpose of economics? Yes, but it's also definitely for the purpose of nationalism. You can see that in this famous picture right here of Perry's delegation coming in to meet the Japanese emperor. And so the Japanese agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa. What did it allow? It opened 2 ports to Western trade and then established a Western trade relationship. It established a U.S. consulate in Japan, proving that the U.S. would have further discussions with Japan in trade and international matters rather than allowing Japan to remain isolated. And it allowed the U.S. to establish a basis for trade in the Pacific, that entry point that they had wanted. And once the United States could enter and make itself known in the Pacific, it would have a shot at changing some of the policy in